The bell over the cafe door chimed like a small, tentative question. Steam curled from cups and drifted over the worn linoleum, softening the morning light that slanted in through the windows. He came in slow, one small step at a time, a backpack sagging at his shoulders, the jitter of a prosthetic foot tapping once against the tile as if testing the room for permission. Everyone looked at him the way people look at weather, briefly, as something to be noted and then set aside. He was smaller than Marcus had expected, not a boy of the street, not ragged or loud. His jacket was serviceable, his hair had been recently cut. The prosthetic, though, told a different story. The socket where flesh met plastic had scuffs, and the foot itself had been patched, the paint worn thin where it caught on doors and steps. He moved as if measuring each impulse before committing, half a breath before he sat, half a smile before he offered it. "Can I sit here?" he asked, pushing a chair back with hands that had the practiced carefulness of someone used to asking permission to exist inside other people's spaces. The first woman he asked smiled politely, made an excuse about a phone call, and pointed to a small table near the window that was already asked for. The man at the counter looked up too briefly to register his question and returned to his laptop. Someone muttered an apology and went back to whatever it was they had decided mattered more than the boy's presence. Politeness stacked into indifference. The room's small refusals folded into each other until the boy stood holding an empty chair like an unanswered invitation. Marcus watched from the back near the espresso machine, one elbow on a high top, a leather jacket creased with an old life. He'd come in for a coffee between routes, his bike keys tucked into his pocket, the low hum of his engine still under his skin. He watched the prosthetic foot tap once, twice, the boy's thumb worrying the strap at the socket. He watched the way the boy's eyes flicked from face to face, searching for the simplest of courtesies. Marcus pushed the chair out and said, "Sit." It was one word, no sermon, no staged heroics. The delivery was matter-of-fact, the kind of invitation that refused to be complicated. The boy slid into the seat with a quiet that belonged to someone relieved not to have to keep explaining himself. They were strangers, but the space between them was brief and clean. Marcus ordered 2 grilled cheeses, the kind of comfort food that takes no ceremony to eat, and hot chocolate for the boy, who accepted it like an allowance of warmth. The café hummed back into itself, the small talk of mornings folding around them. Marcus pretended to be casual, the way people are when they're making room without making a spectacle. Yet as the plates came, things began to show. The boy asked for the bread to be cut in smaller pieces. He turned the mug sideways to cool the chocolate before he sipped. He flinched at the sudden slam of a register drawer, as if loud noises left unseen dents inside him. When he shifted, the socket over the prosthetic left a faint red ring at the edge of his skin, noticeable if you were looking for the way bodies make maps of discomfort. Marcus watched, not like a man looking for drama, but like someone trained to notice what others did not. He had seen people survive hardship. He knew the difference between a boy being guarded and a boy being in need. He let the conversation go where the boy wanted it to. He asked nothing direct at first. He noticed the small phrases the boy left scattered on the table like breadcrumbs. "We eat early," the boy said once, almost to himself. "Uncle likes things tidy, so we eat before he gets back." His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Do you like school?" Marcus asked. "Sometimes," the boy said. He looked down at his hands. "I like science. I had an experiment, but the jar cracked." "Your name?" Marcus asked. "Ethan," he said. The name fit the jaw, the way a name should sit easy in someone's mouth. Ethan. Not a tag, not an echo, a boy. As they ate, subtle details accumulated into a pattern more persuasive than any single remark. Ethan kept one sleeve pulled down half over the socket, as though covering and revealing at once.
He shifted references to meals by time rather than content. He shrugged when asked about the rest of the house. When Sophie, the barista, refilled his cup, she watched him and then, without dramatics, took a quick photo with her manager's phone. Only the table, the boy, the prosthetic, time-stamped to the second. She aimed nothing cruelly at him. The image was a fact, kept in case facts were needed. This was how it began. A boy asking to sit, a rider saying yes, a cup of hot chocolate bought back into the world. And yet Marcus's instincts told him that noticing alone wasn't enough. "Anything else I should know, Ethan?" he asked gently. Ethan chewed around a question. "Sometimes the food's locked," he said finally, eyes on the table. "If you don't ask, you don't get more. My uncle says hungry makes you behave badly." The way he said uncle carried the weight of an account given without commentary. It was neither accusation nor plea. He heard it as a line in a report, a clue. Marcus was not a professional. He was part of a community that ran on brothers-in-arms and coffee hugs, not on case law. But he'd learned over years of patching broken things on the road that good intentions without method could undo more than they did. He had seen people rush in to save and leave behind scenes mangled beyond repair, because evidence had been destroyed, because chaos had been created. He had learned to do the small, patient things that would later allow the right people to act. He thanked Sophie with a look. She nodded and piled napkins into a small stack. Down the counter, Ghost and Tank, two of Marcus's crew, were finishing their cups.
Brick, the group's organizer, had a knack for logistics and a clean habit of turning care into checklists. Marcus leaned in and said quietly, "We need to do this the right way." Ethan listened, finger tracing a seam in the table. He seemed to understand the shift, like a child who had been taught early to spot the serious movements of adults. Marcus asked him if anyone else would mind if he asked a few questions later, and Ethan shrugged. The shrug was not permission so much as acknowledgement. Marcus considered that consent was a circle to be respected, not just permission from the boy, but from the adults whose actions would be involved. Marcus left a half of his sandwich untouched and made a call. It was the kind of call that started with a quiet, "Have you got a minute?" and then arranged people into roles. Brick picked up and asked questions with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen too many fragile situations collapse because people had replaced procedure with impulse. Ghost and Tank agreed to stay nearby. Sophie saved the time-stamped photo and agreed to write down what she could recall: the boy's arrival time, the way he ordered, the offhand comments about food, the red mark. She wrote in plain terms, no adjectives, just the facts. They documented what they could without making the boy feel like he was a case file. Pity could be corrosive, dignity had to be preserved every turn. Marcus stayed at the table, letting the boy talk about school projects and the mundane sorrows a child carried. He recognized the value of small trust. It would keep Ethan in the room long enough for others to collect the data they needed. Any attempt to pull him away or to confront an adult would, Marcus knew, risk everything. When the phone call to Brick ended, Marcus tapped out a short note on his own phone: name, time, photo location, observed signs. He folded his napkin and placed it in his pocket. It was a small thing, but it was the foundation of evidence, handwritten notation that matched the time-stamped image Sophie had taken. Alongside those notes, Marcus typed a simple text to an old contact, Daniels. Daniels had been a cop for years and walked away from the force under quiet circumstances that left him literate in process but wary of headlines. He'd taken consultancy gigs since then, helping community groups understand legal boundaries rather than inciting them to cross them. Marcus respected him because Daniels understood why people wanted to act and also knew how to channel that urgency into lawful motion. He explained what he had noticed in clear, unemotional language. Daniels listened and then asked the questions that only a procedural mind would ask. Do you have timestamps, photographs, witness statements, anything that points to a pattern rather than a single bad day? Marcus answered. Sophie had the photo. He had a note. Ghost and Tank were witnesses. The boy had said meals were locked. The prosthetic showed chafing. The boy flinched at loud noises. Ethan had named an uncle as the adult in charge. "Good," Daniel said. "No one breaks down a door. No one threatens. You document, you preserve, and you hand it to a professional. If the child is in immediate danger, that's an emergency call. If it's concerning over time, you present it to Child Protective Services. Evidence will carry it. Haste without protocol ruins the case." There it was, the line he had meant to draw. Citizens could notice and preserve, but could not perform the work of professionals. Marcus repeated the steps aloud so everyone in the line could hear. Take timestamps, collect statements, avoid confrontation, call in professionals. Across the table, Ethan listened to the adults arrange themselves like a safety net. He did not ask to be rescued. He had only asked for a place to sit. But there is a quiet, steadying thrill for a child who sees adults decide to act, not with flourish, but with record-keeping and restraint. Brick arrived 10 minutes later, the swagger of a man used to finding order in chaos, but with a face softened by the gravity of the moment. He moved through the café like someone careful not to make the scene bigger than it needed to be. He introduced himself to Sophie as a friend and asked her for her full recollection in the terms Daniels had outlined: time, location, what was seen, what was said. He explained to her why they were recording things, not to show off or to punish, but to create a paper trail that could be presented to those who had the authority and responsibility to act. Ghost took another photograph from a different angle. Tank stayed visible but unobtrusive. His presence was comfort that did not command the room. Brick filled in details Ethan had let slip: the boy's habit of cooling hot chocolate, the way he cut his bread. These facts Brick wrote down in a notebook with a simple heading: Observed, Ethan. They did not whisper about the uncle in the café. They did not sketch worst-case scenarios aloud. They spoke in the neutral vocabulary of documentation. That was deliberate. Emotion was a force easily co-opted into stories that made people reckless. Facts were stabilizing. Daniels gave them another instruction. If the child seems at risk right now, signs of active harm, severe dehydration, collapsed breathing, call 911 immediately. Otherwise, call CPS and explain you have concerned citizen reports with corroborating documentation. They will decide on a welfare check and, if necessary, involve law enforcement to obtain a warrant. "How long?" Marcus asked quietly. "Depends," Daniel said. "It depends on the workload, the evidence, the jurisdiction's protocols. But your job is to preserve what's here. Do not confront. Do not remove the child yourself.
Keep him safe where you can, and let professionals do their work." They were a network now. Bikers who had once been friends on the road, a barista who kept receipts and timestamps, a former cop who could translate urgency into process. It was not a band of vigilantes. It was a small machine designed to do the correct, painstaking things that might let the right hands reach Ethan without destroying the case in the process. Ethan's voice cut across those logistical strategies with something softer. "I don't like when he gets mad," he said. "He says it's because I make extra noise. I try not to. I clean my room." Marcus nodded and slid a biscuit across the table. He did not dramatize. He did not ask for a narrative. He let the boy keep what agency he had, to talk when and about what he wished. The café, meanwhile, had become a hub. People came and went, but none of them intruded on the pattern. Sophie placed a neatly folded piece of paper in front of Ethan with a local community center's schedule of after-school programs. "If you want," she said, as if offering a small, normal thing. Ethan's smile at that small gesture was fragile but genuine. It was the first ordinary childlike expression Marcus had seen since the boy had entered. The simplicity of it mattered. Outside, the sound of engines rose and fell. Marcus stepped onto the curb to make one more call. He told Daniels the facts as they stood. He summarized what Sophie had saved, a time-stamped image, a receipt, and her written recollection. He told him about the prosthetic chafing and the boy's offhand comment about locked food. He asked for advice on how to approach CPS without making them suspect vigilante overreach. "Document everything," Daniel said again. "Make it usable. Never break someone else's property to prove anything. That destroys chain of custody. Keep everything you have in one folder. If you have to hand anything over to law enforcement, do it with the documentation intact. If CPS decides a welfare check is warranted, they'll involve police for lawful entry." He listened and then asked a question that had been at the back of his throat since he'd first said, "Sit." What if we don't get anyone to act? What if the system is slow? Daniels answered honestly, "If you have credible, corroborated evidence and you've offered it to the appropriate agencies and nothing is happening, you escalate through the channels. Supervisor at CPS, the local precinct commander, advocacy groups that can apply public pressure without compromising the case. But you must always keep your actions within the law. The moment a citizen's action crosses into enforcement, you've put the child at risk legally and practically." There was a pause. Marcus had wanted a magic lever, a key that would open doors instantly. There wasn't one. Instead, there was the slow, brittle machinery of institutions, which could be urged but not bypassed. He stepped back into the warm clatter of the café.
Ethan had drawn small doodles on the napkin, tiny houses, a little stick figure with a prosthetic leg. The drawing was both unremarkable and the most precise map of need Marcus had seen. He folded the napkin and slid it to the side, then placed his phone carefully beside it. He wanted everything to remain undisturbed until a professional needed it. Brick, Ghost, and Tank had started to assemble more tangible items. Ghost, the steady-handed one, had brought a small recorder and kept it in his pocket, its light blinking discreet. Tank had retraced their steps to make sure the sequence of events was clean in everyone's memory. Sophie had photocopies of the receipt and the photograph saved to a cloud folder with a file name that included the date and time. They were creating a mosaic of ordinary facts that, taken together, suggested a repeated pattern rather than an isolated problem. Luke's law of evidence, Marcus joked to himself. Many small observations could be more convincing than one dramatic claim. They kept everything flat and factual. They avoided adjectives. They avoided pronouns like abuse or neglect in their notes, terms that required professional diagnosis. Instead, they used phrases like concerns regarding access to food and observed skin irritation at prosthetic interface. Ethan watched them organize themselves with the mild curiosity of someone who had once perhaps learned to read adults' intentions like weather reports. He did not press, but he listened. Marcus kept the tone light. He asked about Ethan's favorite subject in school. They talked about experiments and jars and what could be learned when glass broke, how things could be fixed or replaced. By the time they left the café, the team's actions had changed the scene from a private discomfort into something that could be acted upon without improvisation. They had preserved timestamps, photographs, snack wrappers, written recollections, and an eyewitness account noted on a napkin. They had refrained from confrontation. They had put a resource into Ethan's hand, Sophie's community center slip, and had made a clear plan to hand their packet to the professionals who were designed to act on such evidence. They did not go to the house. They did not confront the uncle. They did not attempt rescue.
They knew the lines were there for a reason. Citizens who exceeded them could risk the child's chance at a safe outcome. Marcus thought of the boy's small flinch at the drawer slam and how quickly that flare could be misread by someone who wanted to do more than bear witness. On the way back to their bikes, Ghost asked Marcus if he felt lighter now that something was being done. Marcus thought about that for a moment and answered, "No, but I feel like I'm doing the right things." Daniels had told them to expect friction, that workloads and bureaucracy could slow a welfare check. Marcus had no appetite for naivety. He wanted efficacy.
He took a breath and breathed out a plan into which every member of the small group could fit. They convened at the parking lot behind the café, the motorcycles lined up like a promise. Marcus handed a copy of the files to Brick, who would take it to a local advocate with experience in these cases. They agreed someone would accompany Ethan to his next after-school program if he wanted to attend. They agreed to stagger their presence. No congregation at the boy's address if they learned it. No pressure, no crowding. Before they left the lot, Marcus took Ethan's hand and, without theatrics, asked if he would like a ride to the library tomorrow. It was an offer of normalcy, the kind that mattered more than rescue speech. Ethan nodded, small and cautious. The group dispersed into their separate motions, Brick to logistics, Tank to be the visible support around the neighborhood, Ghost to keep an eye on the bureaucratic follow-ups. Marcus walked Ethan to the corner and let him choose a paperback from a little bookstall. He bought it for him and wrote on the inside cover, in a hand that had patched many things, a small note. For Ethan, keep asking questions. They did not promise the boy the world. They promised to stay present in small, practical ways without stepping over legal lines. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the napkin and the photos spread out like a map, the smell of his coffee cooling beside them. He called Daniels again to check the phrasing they would use when they approached CPS, clear, unemotional, document-rich. Daniels reassured him the system moved when it had proof. Marcus believed that, but he also believed in the grit of persistence. At a certain point after the café, Marcus's role shifted from rescuer to steward. His job was not to single-handedly fix Ethan's life, but to make sure that what he had seen was recorded well enough that the right hands could take over. He took that responsibility seriously. Ethan sat at a table in his small room that night, the prosthetic foot catching the lamplight where the socket met skin. He unfolded the torn corner of the napkin from his pocket and smoothed it carefully, as if applying a small ritual. There was a fragility to the movement, a child measuring the edges of safety, seeing where adults had placed steps. He did not sleep easily, but the small details, someone had smiled at him, someone had bought him hot chocolate, someone had offered to go to the library, stayed like warm coins in his palm. The next morning felt colder. Marcus and Brick met with Daniels in a diner just off the highway, their voices low and businesslike amid the click of silverware. They reviewed the evidence as if it were a blueprint: Sophie's time-stamped photo, the napkin note, the receipt, the written witness statements. Daniels made quick, exact notes about what would be necessary for CPS to request a welfare check. He explained how the process worked in plain language. CPS would assess the evidence and decide whether to request police assistance for a welfare check, and if the threshold for probable cause was met, a warrant could be sought. He emphasized again the importance of chain of custody, documents and photos preserved without tampering. "Will that be enough?" Brick asked. "Potentially," Daniels said. "It shows pattern, which is what the agencies look for. But it's not about any single photo or note. It's about whether those materials, combined, reasonably indicate the child's safety is compromised." They were careful with the words. They avoided the kind of charged vocabulary that would make headlines.
They focused on what the system would require: corroboration, continuity, lawful process. They drafted a packet. Marcus typed the timeline and included precise timestamps. Sophie's photograph was converted into a read-only file and stored in 2 places. Ghost burned a copy to a disk and uploaded another to a secure cloud folder with access limited to the people in their small chain. Tank collected names and phone numbers of people who were willing to provide statements if needed. No one in the room imagined an instant fix. They imagined instead the grind of paperwork and the slow, patient agitation of persistence. The work was not glamorous. It was necessary. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had arranged a call with Lena, a CPS investigator who had a reputation for careful but decisive work. He explained the facts succinctly and emailed the packet. Lena listened and promised to review it. She did not commit to action on the spot. That was not how the process went. But she thanked him for gathering the materials and reiterated the steps she would take: review, determine if a welfare check was necessary, and if so, coordinate with law enforcement for lawful entry if needed. The waiting began. Marcus felt the particular anxiety of someone who had started a chain reaction but did not yet see the end of it. He understood that patience could be misread as weakness. He also knew impulsiveness could ruin everything. He went back to the café that evening, not to hunt for drama, but because Ethan had asked. He found the boy at the same table, small and resolute. The scarlet ring of the socket's irritation still marked the skin. Ethan looked up when he entered, and for the first time that week his shoulders were not as tight. "How's the Burke?" Marcus asked. Ethan's face brightened in the way that Marcus think of light finding a seam in a dark room. "It's about rockets," Ethan said. "I want to make one that goes to the moon." "Then we shall," Marcus said. He did not promise space. He promised to be present on the ground where the boy built the first pieces. Marcus kept his phone within reach the next days. Calls came and went.
Lena reviewed the packet, made a few follow-up questions to confirm details. There were no immediate red alerts, no collapsing breathing or imminent hazard. The files suggested chronic concern. That placed the case into a different, slower track, one that required proof, not passion. They organized volunteers to be visible without being intrusive. Tank dropped off a book bag one afternoon with some school supplies and a note that said simply, "For Ethan, learn lots." Brick checked the community center's patron list for any record of Ethan attending and found none. Sophie arranged for a volunteer to keep an eye on the boy in a way that respected boundaries, showing up at after-school programs and making a note of attendance without imposing. Everyone understood the stakes. The danger, for Marcus, was how ordinary everything could look, and therefore how easy it would be for a pattern of neglect to persist. That ordinariness was a kind of camouflage. It took someone willing to add up small details over time to see the shape of the problem. Then, one afternoon, as Marcus stood on the corner waiting for Ethan to finish a homework session supervised by Sophie, his phone rang. It was Lena. She had reviewed the packet and, after consulting her supervisor, believed there was sufficient basis to request a welfare check. She would coordinate with the local precinct to determine whether police assistance would be requested for lawful entry if the door were not opened. Marcus felt the surge of adrenaline he had anticipated and feared in equal measure. This was the point where documentation met action. He thought of Daniel's instructions: do not let zeal translate into trespass. Let the process run its course. He walked Ethan to the car, keeping his own manner low and calm. Ethan's small fingers fit into his hand like a child's hand into a glove. The boy did not ask where they were going.
He only allowed himself to be led, which in itself was a quiet act of trust. Marcus called Brick and asked him to keep the perimeter peaceable and to have Sophie present as a witness at the café in case she was needed to corroborate timelines. He told Ghost to hold off on any public social posts. This was not a moment for broadcasting. They had worked too hard to avoid turning a delicate situation into a spectacle. On the drive, short and flushed with the odd intimacy of these small missions, Ethan asked Marcus, "Do you think they'll believe me?" Marcus looked at him in the rearview mirror, seeing how a child's face could be serious in the way adults thought they were. "They'll look at what we saw, and we'll give them everything we have. That's the best any of us can do." When they arrived at the address Ethan had given them, Marcus felt the weight of the next step. This was where restraint could be tested, where the temptation to barge through the door and choose one's brand of justice could be loud.
He steadied himself with the knowledge that doing the right thing required waiting for the right authority. He handed the packet to Lena in person. She clutched it like an architect with a blueprint that might be difficult to execute, but necessary. They coordinated carefully. Lena would assess, consult, and then request police assistance if the child's safety warranted it. Marcus felt the hum of the bureaucracy move, slow but inevitable. Ethan sat on the curb while adults exchanged numbers and timelines. He drew small pictures on a pad Marcus had given him and offered one, an awkward, earnest house with a motorcycle in the yard, to Marcus before slipping back into his pocket. Marcus kept the drawing folded near his heart. There are moments in such sequences that feel like quiet precipices, the small breath between a plan and its execution. Marcus and his crew had done what they could without overstepping. They had catalogued and preserved. They had translated concern into a packet that could be understood by someone with the authority to act. Now the next part, official entry, inspections, the search for patterns inside the home, would be undertaken by Lena and her team, in coordination with law enforcement if necessary. Marcus knew the child's life could change in minutes or in months. He did not delude himself about the certainty of outcomes. He only held to the facts they had made and to the patience required for the system to process them. As they left Ethan with Sophie and a warm blanket she had tucked around his knees, Marcus felt the odd tightness of hope that wasn't yet ready to be named. It was not relief. It was the precarious hovering before a decision lands. The next steps would require more than courage. They would require adherence to process and the steady, often unglamorous work of professionals who could convert their mosaic of facts into protective measures. When he climbed back on his bike that evening, he did not feel like a man who had saved someone. He felt like one who had kept a promise to act within the lines, to notice, to document, and to hand over what he knew to those who could legally and ethically do the rest. If this matters to you, if stories of quiet noticing and careful action are the sort of things you'd like to see more of, consider subscribing. It helps us share more stories where ordinary acts meet the right procedures and where communities learn to protect their most vulnerable. Lena read the packet twice before she folded it into the folder that would begin a case file. Her voice on the phone was both procedural and human. She thanked Marcus and the others for their thoroughness, then outlined the next steps. She would go in for a welfare check. If the door was answered and the situation resolved without evidence of ongoing harm, that might be the end of it. If not, she would ask for police assistance to obtain lawful entry or, if probable cause existed, a warrant.
Marcus listened without theatrics. He had done his part. Now he would step back and let the trained people move forward. When Lena arrived at the small house Ethan had given as his address, she approached with the deliberate calm of someone who did this work often, steady hands instead of dramatic gestures. She knocked, announced herself through the door, and waited for a response. A man with a closed posture answered, Ethan's uncle.
He invited them in with a voice that was polite on the surface. Lena's eyes catalogued impressions the way an investigator catalogues facts. The house smelled of old stew and dust. Curtains were drawn. A padlocked kitchen cabinet in the back of the room caught her attention. It was an ordinary concession in its own way, plausible, but in the context of Marcus's packet, it was also an object to note. Lena asked benign questions first. She watched for inconsistencies and for signs that corroborated what the packet suggested. When she asked about meal times, the man described a routine that matched Ethan's words: early dinners, little left afterwards, lockboxes for snacks. He called the boy by name in a way that was brusque but not overtly hostile. Lena's field notes filled with neutral observations: padlock on lower pantry cabinet, no visible large quantities of fresh food, evidence of limited refrigeration. She did not speculate, she recorded. At the kitchen cabinet, a padlock was fixed to an otherwise ordinary latch. Lena logged it with a photograph and a timestamp, careful to keep a chain of custody intact. The uncle claimed it was to keep animals out, an explanation that could not be dismissed casually, but that needed checking against other data. Lena asked whether Ethan had access to the pantry and received a reluctant reply: "We keep things for later." It was not the same as a confession of rationing, but paired with the other materials, it was a pattern. Because of the totality of evidence, Sophie's time-stamped photograph, multiple witness statements, Ethan's own comments, and physical signs like the padlock, Lena made the decision to seek further action. She requested a police presence to secure lawful entry should that become necessary. The precinct's liaison reviewed the packet and agreed to support a welfare intervention, emphasizing the need for a properly obtained warrant to ensure evidence would stand up in court if needed. The warrant was sought and granted on the basis of probable cause documented in Lena's report: a pattern of restricted access to food, observed skin irritation where the prosthetic met Ethan's limb, and multiple corroborating witness statements. The judge who reviewed the request did so with attention to balancing the child's safety and the rights of the adult in the household. The application included dates and the chain of custody of the photographs and written statements.
When the time came, the officers executed the warrant with restraint and respect. Lena present, and Marcus and Brick waiting at a sensible distance. Inside the house, the officers moved in methodically. They did not dramatize. They photographed. They logged. They recorded each step for precisely the reasons Daniels had explained: chain of custody. In a back cabinet, a padlock was removed in an inventoried procedure, and inside officers found rows of labeled cans and wrapped packages, some with dates indicating long storage, some with notes about portions. A small notebook was recovered from a drawer. It contained dates and terse entries describing when meals were given and when extra was accessed. The notebook's text did not read like a confession so much as a ledger of control. Lena transcribed it in neutral language: notes regarding distribution of food items and scheduled mealtimes. Ethan watched the strangers move with an alertness that made Lena think of a child assessing where safety might be placed. He clung to the small familiar object he had tucked in his pocket, the napkin drawing of a house with a motorcycle on the porch. Marcus had kept a discreet distance, but remained a visible, calm presence. He had not barged into the house. He had not inflamed the scene. His role had been to witness and to support the transfer of evidence to professionals. The uncle was escorted out of the house to be interviewed. He did not resist physically. He was later charged with neglect after Lena's team found that the totality of evidence suggested deliberate restriction of access to food and failure to meet the child's basic needs. That legal step would unfold in court with its own burdens of proof and procedure. For now, Ethan was placed into temporary protective custody with arrangements made for immediate medical assessment. At the hospital, medical staff performed a careful examination. They did not speak in accusations. They documented weight and height measured against appropriate norms,
blood work that suggested mild nutritional deficit but not acute failure, and skin examined under the prosthetic socket for signs of chafing and minor sores that required treatment. None of the findings were sensational. They were specific and practical. A pediatric nurse explained the plan to Ethan with an adult's lightness that respected his age. A nutrition plan to restore calories and nutrients over weeks, topical treatment for the skin, and a referral to a pediatric prosthetist. Dr. Rivera, the prosthetist mentioned in the packet, received the referral. Her clinic smelled of clean plastic, warm glue, and the patient-centered focus that comes from decades of fitting devices to bodies. She examined the socket and found that it had gaps and pressure points, places where the fit had been poor for some time. That inadequate fit explained both the chafing and some of the boy's guarded movement. Dr. Rivera explained in simple terms, an ill-fitting socket can cause skin breakdown and pain, and that makes a child avoid using a prosthesis as much as possible. We can make adjustments and plan for a new socket, but it takes time. She scheduled fitting sessions and connected the case manager to Alina, a social worker who would join Lena in managing Ethan's case. Alina introduced herself to Ethan in the soft way professionals use when they are planting a seed of trust. She did not promise permanency, she promised routines. She discussed a schedule of meals, hygiene checks, and medical follow-ups. She listened when Ethan spoke about school and his rocket book. She named his hopes aloud so he could hear a grown-up repeat them back. Rockets, experiments, a future to build. The repetition of ordinary things, bedtimes, breakfasts, library trips, was part of what recovery would require. Rosa, a therapist with training in trauma-informed care, began to see Ethan next. Her approach was slow and small, drawing instead of interrogation, games instead of probing. Ethan's sketches were first hesitant, rocket parts that misaligned or a house with windows closed, but with weeks a different vocabulary emerged. A stick figure with a prosthetic that was smiling, a porch with light spilling onto the grass. Rosa taught Ethan small grounding techniques for panic, a counting exercise, a way of noticing the weight of his feet against the floor. She also worked with Marcus and other adults on how to respond when Ethan recoiled at loud noises or sudden movement, simple scripts that preserved dignity and reduced surprise. The legal process took its own measured course. Judge Patricia Chen presided over preliminary hearings with a professional gravity that foregrounded the child's welfare. In a modest courtroom, no dramatics, newspapers at the edges, evidence was presented. Lena testified to the observed facts, the padlocked pantry and the notebook ledger, and the witness statements. Dr. Rivera described the prosthetic issues and medical findings. The uncle's attorney argued mitigating circumstances. The judge listened, asked clarifying questions, and focused on the statutory standard, the child's best interests. During one hearing, the judge turned to Ethan with a care that was more human than courtroom formality. She asked, "Ethan, is there anyone here you feel safe with?" The question allowed the child to name his supports. He glanced toward Marcus, toward the spectators who had gathered quietly, and said in a small voice that carried a weight far beyond his years, "Marcus." Marcus did not seek that naming, nor did he assume it. He had been present, and he remained clear that his role was part of a larger effort. But the judge took the child's naming into account as a matter of protective placement, not as an invitation to immediate guardianship. The judge issued an interim protective order that prioritized Ethan's residential stability and required supervised visits with extended family until a fuller assessment could determine long-term placement. The court also ordered services, medical follow-up, prosthetic care, therapy, and ongoing monitoring by CPS. The months after the warrants and hearings were not cinematic in the way rescue stories tend to be. They were granular. Appointments scheduled, timelines met, setbacks managed. Dr. Rivera's first attempt at a refit needed 2 revisions. A revised socket took shape after measurements, casts, and fittings. Each iteration improved comfort by small increments. Each adjustment was celebrated but also contextualized as part of a slow arc. The nutrition plan evolved into practical routines. Morning oatmeal, school lunches, afternoon snacks, administered in ways that restored calories and dignity. Marcus and Brick took turns driving Ethan to appointments, not as grand gestures, but as consistent logistics: a ride at 8:15, pickup at 3:20. School was an arena of its own. Teachers were informed with as much privacy as possible, and the school counselor worked with Rosa to support Ethan's reintegration. He struggled at first with loud cafeterias and sudden gym class bell schedules. Small accommodations, sitting near a friend, wearing a hat during noisy assemblies were introduced, each a modest scaffolding that allowed learning to proceed without spotlight. The Bikers network continued to support, but in ways designed to avoid creating dependency or spectacle. Ghost brought language books and a small telescope for Ethan's rockets. Tank organized a low-key birthday in the community center. Pancakes, a handmade card, a small cardboard rocket taped together by the crew. Brick coordinated volunteers for short, discreet check-ins. Sophie organized a library night where Ethan could pick out books and sit in a corner with a blanket and read aloud to a small, respectful audience. It was not heroism, it was steady kindness. There were setbacks, naturally. A supply chain delay postponed one prosthetic part. A court date stretched out because witness availability required rescheduling. Ethan had nights when sleep was thin and nightmares edged in. Those nights were met by the adults who were allowed into his life. A blanket, Rosa's calming words over the phone, a text from Marcus that said only, "Here if you need." Healing was not linear, it was iterative. As the case moved toward a more permanent resolution, Alina compiled a case plan that recommended a path toward guardianship for a family resource who could demonstrate stability. That path included background checks, financial assessments, and a parenting plan under CPS oversight. It also included the possibility of kinship placement if a relative met the criteria. The judge asked for periodic updates and required programs for the accused adult, courses and monitoring as part of the legal process.
Throughout these months, the Bikers were careful to avoid being cast as the central story. Journalists inquired, and Marcus politely declined most interviews, insisting the child's privacy mattered more than a human interest slugline. When photos were taken for necessary legal reasons, they were limited, documented, and kept off public feeds. The team respected the boundary between substance and spectacle. There were small but meaningful markers of progress. One brisk morning, after a months-long sequence of prosthetic adjustments, Ethan learned to hop on his prosthetic foot in a way that made him laugh loud enough to spill his cereal. It was not triumphalist, it was a private delight that he then shared with Marcus, who joined in a grin that was more like relief than pride. The laugh traveled through the room to the other adults, and for a moment everyone felt the compound return of patience and proper procedure. Another marker came when Ethan was given a new pair of sneakers sized for his needs. He chose bright blue ones with rocket embroidery. That choice, simple, childlike, was a quiet testimony to the restoration of preference and agency. He drew a new picture, this time of a house with a son and a child in the window waving from a prosthetic foot. He tucked it into an envelope with a sticky note, "For Marcus." Legal resolution arrived in phases. The uncle was arraigned and later pled to neglect charges. Sentencing included supervised probation, therapeutic requirements, and a no-contact order while the child's placement was in flux. The court prioritized the child's safety and access to care over punitive spectacle. The system was not a clean machine, it was an assemblage of agencies that could render a protective environment when evidence and patience were combined. Ultimately, after assessments and supervised reports, the judge signed an order for protective placement with a vetted family resource who demonstrated a stable environment and a willingness to support Ethan's medical and educational needs.
The order allowed for ongoing visitation by Marcus and the community supports that had formed around the boy, arranged through Alina and supervised by CPS to ensure the child's safety. Guardianship processes continued, with the understanding that it was a pathway contingent on demonstrated stability and continued services. Months later, in a small living room with sunlight on the floorboards, a modest gathering marked a kind of coming together. Alina and Lena sat in chairs with files that now looked more like histories than emergencies. Dr. Rivera leaned against a doorway with a thermal sling of tools on her hip. Rosa had a small stack of drawings made by Ethan over the course of treatment, each one an index of his inner weather. The bikers, Marcus, Brick, Ghost, Tank, sat in a way that suggested they were visitors rather than proprietors of the story.
They had brought a low-key cake, candles on top. Ethan's new sneakers were by the couch. Ethan blew out the candles without making a show of it. He accepted a small cardboard rocket from Ghost, and with a gravity that belonged to someone who had learned to be careful with joy, placed it on the shelf. Marcus gave him a small keychain, nothing flashy, just a tiny enamel motorcycle. Ethan clipped it to the strap of his backpack and smiled in a way that showed the slow work of reassembling trust. On an afternoon months into recovery, Marcus sat at the kitchen table alongside Alina and a caseworker to review the next steps in transitioning care. There were forms and dates and required check-ins. The word permanency hung in the room like a warrant of commitment, not promised as miraculous healing, but structured as a framework of checks, supports, and accountability. Ethan sat across from them, feet swinging, a book open but not being read. He was listening, as children do, to adults calibrate the world that would hold them. At a routine review, the judge assigned a long-term plan, a supervised guardianship with periodic reviews and a clear schedule for services. There were contingencies and assessments, but the plan emphasized what mattered most: a stable home, ongoing medical care, school stability, and therapeutic support. The judge commended the community's role in careful documentation and referred to the packet as an exemplar of how citizen vigilance and professional process can dovetail to produce protective outcomes without compromising evidence or safety. In the months that followed, Ethan's routines normalized in a sober way that life does when time is allowed to change into habit. Mornings had pancakes and toothpaste and a backpack slung over a shoulder. Therapy sessions were scheduled and sometimes missed because life was life, and then rescheduled because life was also repair. Dr. Rivera completed a final socket refit that improved comfort and range subtly but meaningfully. Ethan's gait steadied. At school, he joined an after-school robotics club and, with Ghost's patient help, built a small model rocket that launched into a tidy, careful arc at the school's science fair. The community continued to support him in quiet ways: library outings, an annual motorcade that rode slowly past the house without honking, more of a respectful procession than a parade, providing continuity without spectacle. The bikers never claimed sole credit. When strangers asked, Marcus would say, "We noticed and we documented, then we let the professionals do what they do best." He emphasized systems and restraint because he had learned that the work of saving a life was not a headline, it was the accumulation of small, legally sound interventions. Ethan's voice grew steadier in the months ahead. He learned to articulate needs without apology. He learned to ask for help when his socket chafed and to request extra yogurt when he felt particularly hungry.
He learned to trust adults in ways measured and sensible. He also learned the gratitude that sits in simple places: a grilled cheese that was whole, a library with a children's section, a sold-out science kit that made him grin like a boy who had found a new way to be fascinated. The last scene of the formal case file closed not with fireworks, but with a modest ceremony. At a small hearing, the judge acknowledged progress, the child's weight trajectory corrected, a stable setting in place, therapeutic milestones met, and signed an order that moved the case into a stage focused on long-term support rather than acute protective measures. It was not a final happily ever after, but a legal recognition that the child's immediate safety had been secured, and that the state's role would shift from emergency response to supportive oversight. Weeks after that hearing, in a living room warmed by late afternoon sun, Ethan sat with Marcus on the couch. A small cardboard rocket rested between them like a shared secret. Marcus had showed him how to balance the toy on a fold of paper to make it stand upright. Ethan looked at the little rocket, then at the porch where a motorcycle sat in the yard, and then at Marcus. He set the toy in Marcus's hand and said, in a voice that carried the distance of all the small acts that had brought them there, "Thank you for sitting with me." Marcus, who had learned to be succinct in moments that do not demand flourish, ruffled Ethan's hair and replied, "You kept asking questions. I just listened." Ethan smiled, a true, unguarded smile that belonged to the steadiness of regained childhood. He leaned his head back against the couch cushions, and after a short silence that felt heavy with the weight of regained safety, he said, quietly, with the kind of simple certainty that only a child who has been gently reassembled can have, "I'm home." The sentence landed not as a triumphant claim, but as a factual update on the state of his life. Home, in that moment, was not perfect. It was a place with routines, people who had proven reliable, medical supports in place, and the slow promise of normalcy. It was also an index of communal care, citizens who noticed, documented, and handed the facts to the right agencies, professionals who acted within the law, and friends who stayed present without seeking glamour. If this story matters to you, there are practical ways to help in the real world. Notice, document, preserve, and contact the appropriate authorities. Do not attempt to enforce the law yourself. If you suspect a child is in danger, call your local emergency number for immediate threats or your Child Protection Services hotline for concerns that require investigation. Keep records, dates, times, photos with timestamps, witness statements, and present them to professionals who can act. Share this video with someone who needs to learn how ordinary vigilance can become a life-saving force when it is channeled legally and respectfully. Links to verified child protection resources and how-to report guides are in the description below. If you are moved to act, use the channels designed to protect children and preserve evidence. It's the clearest way to turn a small act of noticing into lasting safety.